Welcome to Strictly Facts, a guide to Caribbean history and culture, hosted by me, Alexandria Miller. Strictly Facts teaches the history, politics, and activism of the Caribbean and connects these themes to contemporary music and popular culture. Welcome, people. Welcome back to another episode of Strictly Facts, a guide to Caribbean history and culture. As what some scholars and policymakers call small island developing states, we are a region simultaneously enriched by, but also afflicted by the environment. Whether it is natural disasters like hurricanes, which I think tend to make up most of the conversation oftentimes when it comes to environment and environmental justice, but also things like the protection of our environment from, industrialization, mining, tourism, all things we'll get into today. There are several ways that the environment plays a role in our daily lives. One specifically, though, that I think is not always at the center of our discussion is the impact of the environment on our education. So, joining me for this discussion today is education equity consultant and interdisciplinary scholar, Dr. Jessica S. Samuel. Dr. Samuel, thank you so much for being a guest on this episode. Please tell us a bit about yourself, where, of course, in the Caribbean is near and dear to you, and what led you to this work in education and the environment.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation, Alexandria. It is absolutely a pleasure to be on this podcast, Strictly Facts. I absolutely love the name of it also. I think it's just so indicative of some very Caribbean cultural vibes. And I love that. Yeah, it is a really beautiful thing to be a scholar of the Caribbean. I identify as an Afro Caribbean woman who hails from the US Virgin Islands. I was born and raised on the biggest island of St. Croix, but also raised and spent many years living on the smallest island of St. John, the smallest major island. But I graduated from high school on St. John, and my family, we are actually like through and through Caribbean diaspora people. I'm actually the only native born Virgin Islander in my generation, so my mother's children. My mom actually is from St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and my father is from the neighboring island of St. Lucia. So there's a lot of mix up here. I also have siblings who were born in Trinidad. So we are Caribbean people through and through. We claim the entire region. All of its beautiful diversity and complexity is represented in my identity, who I am, and what I care about. In terms of the work that I do, part of your question is really trying to get at, how did I get into sort of some of the scholar activism, right? This whole notion of being someone who not just studies the region and some of the things that are important, some of the major issues that are important to it, but also who advocates for specific solutions to those problems, right? Who don't just want to pursue inquiry for inquiry's sake. And I would say that sort of activist component of who I am and how I sort of brand myself now was something that began as early as like my high school days. I remember being at the Gift Hill School in St. John and organizing around sort of Black life matter issues before it was even BLM. Like before BLM was a thing, we were organizing for Black lives. And we were Caribbean American students, right? Young people who were not technically African American, but were Black and living in the American Caribbean, right? And so it's funny because I think in the Virgin Islands, we actually have this particular sort of relationship and alignment with the mainland US in ways that are not as readily available with the other Caribbean islands. And so we align ourselves with a lot of the same social justice issues. But that sort of upbringing, I would say, is set the origin of kind of my own investments in activism work in sort of making my scholarship reflect that kind of advocacy. The specific case of education as my field of interest and sort of its relationship to the environment, I would say that this connection and this sort of amalgamated work or topic came about in two ways. First, through my experience as a Teach for America Corps member in St. Louis, Missouri, where I was teaching high school English for 3 years. Then my sort of lived experience as a Virgin Islands woman coming from a US territory. And then thinking about my very specific experience of graduating from the only high school that exists on the island of St. John. And after given the opportunity to really think through how I am situated in my own work, which at the time when I began my PhD studies was very squarely about sort of the experiences of inner city Black students and their relationship to the state, right? And how educators are agents of the state and how education in an American context is a colonial project. I was really given an opportunity to kind of actually situate myself and my home and my upbringing and some of the specifics of being a colonial subject in the work. And so that's where I started to see, okay, so there are different types of environments. There's the built environment, there is a natural environment, and they all impact how education can occur and how it benefits or does not benefit students, and specifically students of color.
I feel like you've almost touched on so many things that we are already planning to talk about for this episode. But I think just as a baseline, why don't we kick off our conversation just talking about how the environment really does affect education, right? And you can do this in two forms, both in just like a general sense, but also specifically to the Caribbean. What does environment look like and how does it shape and impact who and how we are being educated?
Absolutely. Yeah. The environment is actually so important to the education journey and process because when you think about it, where you are educated oftentimes indicates the level of access you have to certain resources. Where we live in the United States, our zip codes, right, determine where we are able to get schooling and where we might be denied schooling, and also the kinds of schooling facilities that are made available to us. And so, in sort of the more built context, I think the environment has such a direct relationship to access to quality education. And we know that this is particularly true for students of color in the United States and its territories, that where they are predominantly residing and existing in large numbers, there tends to be lesser access to quality resources. Students tend to experience decrepit and dilapidated building structures and, like physical environments that are not conducive to learning. And there's been a wealth of scholarship about the relationship between where, like, space, the racialized nature of space and how space making produces certain types of experiences. And when we map that on to the education process, how a space is constructed communicates A, the importance of those occupying that space, and B, what is even possible? What are the expectations of those occupying that space? So if we are in a building that has not been maintained since, how long, that communicates something about the value of the individuals who are forced to occupy that space regardless. And so this is how so many students, especially those from low income backgrounds and racialized minority backgrounds, in many instances where they are being educated, communicates indirectly and implicitly their value as individual people, and as citizens of their communities and of the state. So there's that. There's a physical environment, the built environment, and sort of its impact and import on education. Then there's the natural environment. And I think that this one tends to be a little bit harder to sort of pin down. But in the case of the US Virgin Islands, which is my site of research and study, on the island of St. John, I think the environment tells us a lot about some of our state priorities, right? And in this instance, I think it's really sort of tied up to um, imperial objectives that manifest themselves through environmentalism and conservation. So, for those who do not know, two-thirds of the island of St. John is actually designated as a national park site. And so that means that one-third of the island is actually inhabitable. So individuals are able to build homes and schools and various institutions on only a third of the island. But what's really fascinating about St. John is that though it is majority national park, it is also sort of one of the wealthiest islands, if not the wealthiest island of the US Virgin Islands, right? With the average home costing over $1 million, right? That's the average price of a home on the island. And yet, there is no public high school on the island. And the only secondary educational institution is a private one, the one that I had the privilege of attending while I lived on the island. And I think that this relationship between space and sort of how we say what type of space is meant to be preserved and conserved in what ways and for what purposes can communicate, whether directly or indirectly, sort of the value of those, once again, who are meant to inhabit the space. And so, since the US Virgin Islands are a predominantly and historically African descendant demographic and population of people, there's a really deep relationship and tie between sort of race and space making on the island of St. John. And then when you tie in our status as a territory, right, that very experience and political sort of rendering as a colony even complicates this relationship between the environment and education even more. So the question then becomes, who on St. John is worthy of occupying what space? And what spaces and institutions are in fact worthy of creation, right, on the island? And I think that in that instance, we see sort of a new way of understanding the environment and its relationship to education.
And socioeconomic status as well, right? In terms of this idea of race and space making, because, even thinking of a lot of the stories that I heard growing up, how many miles this aunt or this parent or whoever had to trek to go to school. And these are not just, I think sometimes we laugh about those things or, think less of them because they're just stories to make us feel guilty for wanting modern day contemporary things, right? But these are very much so environmental and structural issues that continue to affect something that should be a basic human right as education. I think even pushing that further, you mentioned the fact of like neocolonialism and conservationism. And so I think a great point for turning specifically to your research on the Virgin Islands is thinking about how these concepts of, colonialism, neocolonialism, even ecotourism has affected populations in your native St. John.
Yeah. So it's been overwhelming for St. Johnians, especially I would say, sort of in the heart of COVID and post COVID, as it pertains to tourism. I think that history can track all the way back. But for the sake of sort of contemporary examples, I would say that COVID-19 was perhaps one of the most significant periods of time in our sort of contemporary history as an island, because it, I would say, really illustrated in this really condensed and sort of concentrated fashion how problematic St. John's sort of positionality and orientation as an island in the Virgin Islands and in the Caribbean has been. The ways in which it has become almost exclusively a site of massive consumption. So many people were flocking to the US Virgin Islands during COVID at a time when folks should have been sitting at home, sheltering in place, keeping themselves and those around them safe. People completely relocated their families to live in the territory because they either were, upset about some of the policies and legislations that were in place about COVID-19 and wanted to have to escape responsibility, or they felt like they were just not wanting to deal with, the drama of it all and would rather escape to some sort of American paradise where they could have sort of unbridled access to the tropical isles and not really have to think too much about the consequences of like this pandemic. And then the people of the islands, especially St. John, had to sort of receive the brunt of all of that. And it was really taxing. It had become very taxing for the local economy, for people just generally. There was too many people on St. John. And it was in a way that, did not make anyone feel good. It wasn't as if it was like, oh my God, we're getting so many tourist dollars. Thank God for that. It was almost like, it was an overexhaustion of that tourism model to a degree that really left a lot of people overwhelmed. Structurally, the infrastructure just did not have space for it. And I think that this sort of speaks to some of the worst parts of what it means to be situated within the context of a Caribbean tourism model. And while the entire region, for the most part, touts that industry as sort of its, you know, primary saving grace, if you will, we know for decades now, we've known that there are so many negative drawbacks to sort of that industry and its preponderance throughout the region. And on islands like St. John that are only 19 square miles, the stressors that come with that, they are felt in such an acute fashion. And I think, that sort of aspect of neocolonialism is made very apparent in moments of crisis, in moments of emergency, which the pandemic has been, right? What happens to us when the world is struggling? And that very question of like, what happens to small Caribbean island nations or territories, is something that is not just posed during sort of these moments of tourism excess, but also in the larger question of like, where are we in sort of the environmental project? Where are we in terms of the Anthropocene, and humankind's sort of relationship to nature and the environment and the world, to the earth? What happens to us, young, small island nations and groups? What becomes of us? And that's a question that we're constantly grappling with, because what we've seen so far is that we are either expendable or overused/exploited.
I think the history of environmentalism and conservation specifically in St. John poses a really um I don't want to say interesting because that's such an open, free word, right? But I think oftentimes when we think of the Caribbean, we're thinking of the environment, it's always from a perspective of almost destruction, right? The ways that we are and have been destroyed in a sense, right? But with the case of St. John and, Rockefeller's whole model to create this national park system, right? And as an addendum of the US national park system, it is really like just a model of colonialism in a sense, right? That I think is the most banal way to put it because at face value, you're okay, oh my gosh, right? We're trying to conserve lands and, protect the environment in a sense. But in a lot of ways, what he did and what the entire system behind that and organization behind that did was really an effort to strip the native Afro Virgin Islands people of not only the right of their access to space, as you've been talking about, but their ability to vocalize what they want to do with this island that they've called home for centuries upon centuries. So while I'm giving a very brief, summary of what that looked like, could you talk a bit about how that even just came to be and what has been the structural effects of the park being built and how it's now, how many ever decades later has still continued to hold ramifications for St. John.
Yeah. So I'd say, the national park, the Virgin Islands National Park, is actually the proper name for it, but it's almost exclusively, if not just primarily, located on the island of St. John. Is an interesting, I would say, environmental project and conservation project because its very formation speaks to two things really well. I think it speaks to some of the paradoxes of empire and colonialism. And by that, I mean the ways in which empire will consistently exploit people, resources, goods, and things, and then sort of have to shift and kind of convert itself into something else in order to then repair the harms caused. So, for anyone who knows of the history of conservation in the United States, that history dates as far back as the late 18th, early 19th century. And a lot of it came out of the recognition that with advancements in various industrial projects was also a stark decrease of natural resources and exhaustion of natural resources. And so, the Earth's resources were proven more and more to not be limitless. And many leaders and legislators and wealthy financiers who had a passion for this sort of realization said to themselves, we need to start conserving. We can't just be thinking about how we produce some of our industrial products in this moment for this time and kind of do that with like unbridled. We have to think about the future. And so conservation is necessarily a project of futurity because it considers what happens to us down the road and how can we ensure that there is enough to go around, and specifically that our progeny, and in this instance is a progeny of very wealthy and sort of well-connected white men, could have access to the beauties of the world, of the environment, of the natural resources therein. And so the National Park Service as an entity was then created to sort of execute this aim, right? The objective is where around the US can we ensure the preservation of some of the most beautiful and scenic sites of our environment for future generations to enjoy and to be educated about, right? But the idea was that our natural environment was a place for enjoyment, right? The Sierra Club is one of the greatest examples of sort of, what participating in wilderness really means to sort of the American aesthetic of environmentalism and natural enjoyment and outdoor involvement. And so on St. John, we have this man who comes from a historically wealthy, deeply politically tied community family, which is the Rockefellers, who on a visit as a tourist to the islands falls in love with the island of St. John. And this man, in many ways, had been very much so tied up to these projects of conservation prior to founding the Virgin Islands National Park in 1956. Lawrence Rockefeller had been involved in the formation of several other national parks on the continental United States. And he saw an opportunity in the tropical isles in America's Caribbean to sort of advance this aim as well and do so, very particularly. For Virgin Islands people and St. Johnnians very specifically, this history is best represented as what one island woman, Miss Theodora Moorhead, would call benevolent exploitation. Because in many ways, the effort to want to conserve the natural resources of this gem or this jewel included a passion and desire for safekeeping, right? Which on its surface is benevolent, but at the same time, sort of happened at the expense of Native Virgin Islanders' input and even their full understanding of the project. Because today, when you speak to Native Virgin Islanders, ancestral Virgin Islanders, people whose family go back for generations, if not centuries, many of them will tell you that a lot of the land that now comprises the Virgin Islands National Park was sort of backhandedly gained from that federal entity. And the national park itself has, on several occasions, I think, sort of addressed those claims, but mostly denied that any sort of foul play took place in the acquisition of land, and that most of the lands that does make up the national park don't even come from these people, right? So that's sort of like the contending, conflicting debate and discourse that's going on St. John, which I think in and of itself is so fascinating. Sort of this idea of institutional memory and whose memory is seen to be the most legitimate. And even if certain documents may not necessarily indicate that land was exchanged in some sort of nefarious fashion, the sentiment that many Native Virgin Islanders believe that the very presence of the Virgin Islands National Park poses as a nuisance, if not an entire threat, is still one I think that is worthy of contending with, right? And worthy of our attention. And I see sort of the project of wanting to preserve for the sake of, setting aside for future enjoyment as an interesting one, but it connects to sort of the second thing that I see as sort of illustrated through the very establishment of the Virgin Islands National Park, which is that the project of conservation itself, necessarily as a historical one, excludes people of color. And in the case of St. John, we see that, right? It is a microcosm of this entire history, one that began with sort of the extraction and exploitation of land from indigenous communities on the mainland US. So when we think about, the environment and its protection and what needs to be protected, I think the biggest question for us in the Caribbean, and specifically on the island of St. John, is where are local people? Where are Native people in these conversations? Not just where are they in sort of deciding, whether or not we should have a national park, how big it should be, how much it should expand, if there should be limitations on its existence, but also, where are we in terms of our own priorities and necessities as local Native people who are of color, who are Black, and have a specific history of racialized colonization? Where are we in the decision making processes and even in how we think about the benefits of conservation? Because in many ways, sort of preserving or museumizing nature does not always serve the needs of local communities.
Especially when you exist on a small island, right? There our priorities don't look the same as they do for conservatism, as well as who's also to say that we're not conserving, right? It may not look in that same shape, but we do have our own ways, ancestral ways also of conserving, that just don't mirror what is traditionally known as conserving. To that point, right? The other place where I want us to push our conversation is in this factor of benevolent exploitation. You see this issue of public schooling in St. John really coming about. And I know in your research, one that has long been mobilized within the last, few months or so, there have been, talks of changes. But again, this is, as you noted, a history that has been long advocated for. So could you talk to us a bit about how the face of education and education mobilization, particularly by Black St. Johnians, has been really shaped and affected by this need for environmentalism?
Yeah, absolutely. So I actually wanted to touch on the comment that you made earlier about, different forms of environmentalism and conservation and sort of how Black Indigenous practices are often sort of undervalued as legitimate ways of sort of relating to, caring for, and preserving nature. What's so fascinating is that there are a few other national parks in American territories. There's one in Puerto Rico, El Yunque, and that has a very long history. And then there is the National Park of American Samoa. And in American Samoa, what's really interesting is that their national park actually came about after they were giving the right to elect their own governor, because for a very long time, territories did not immediately get that political right. And in sort of creating the national park, American Samoans actually had a very direct hand in its formation. And with that situation, you see sort of an alternative to like what the national park process could look like and what its benefits could be. And part of their plans for developing their national park involved provisions for subsistence farming. So the national park in the American Samoa context is not simply a museumized space where tourists can engage and come and do their hiking trips and camp out when they feel like it, and certain segments can be leased off to external hotel agencies, right? And then money can be made and go wherever they go, right? Which is the case for St. John, right? These individuals who are native to the island engage and interact with their environment in a way that is representative of their cultural needs and is reflective of their own agendas and histories and priorities as a people. And so I think it's such a beautiful case and an example, sort of like this contrasting example of what is possible. Because what many people will say and have said, especially in the context of St. John, is that this is just the way national parks are, right? They're meant to be these spaces that are inflexible, and that it's exclusively about preserving the environment and keeping it pristine so we can simply engage with it in a way that fosters a tourism sort of model and construct. Now, for St. Johnians, this has been like the crux of their contention, because if we are already operating from the mindset and premise that this space should be engaged in a specifically tourist kind of way, then some of the more practical needs of the local population, and I don't even want to say practical because not everything that is practical is sort of valuable to the greater good of a community or even how they engage its environment. But I think when we think about something like education, that is a public good and in many ways has been declared sort of a public right, there are some concessions that should be made. And for so long, I think the national park has essentially said that they disagree. They're like, we will give you land for a school since there is a scarcity of land, but you have to give us land back. And, on the surface, it might seem like, okay, well, I guess that's a fair trade. Like the national park wants to retain sort of its boundaries and the extent of its size. So give something to get something. And, prioritizing giving local children access to secondary education should be on everyone's mind and agenda. However, what many Virgin Islanders have argued, and I would say rightfully so, is that the very project of conservation and the very federal imperial project of the National Park Service system is one that has been historically exploitative and dismissive of people of color's experiences, and even their very presence, and that it has helped to foster sort of an extraction and overconsumption of people's resources, right? And so in that sense, And for those reasons, a school should be given and donated by the park, or at least a space for a school should be, right? So many people have said, we don't agree with that. And this is why there still is no high school, because for decades, I would say that Virgin Islanders and St. Jonians specifically have held their foot to the ground on principle, which is we're not giving up nothing else to get what should be our very basic right, which is access to comprehensive education. And if we don't get anything by way of our citizenship as American citizens, including the right to vote for president, at the very least, you could extend toward us in terms of our civic and political rights, the ability to educate ourselves on our own island. And I think that has been some of the pushback, right? And really at the heart of the debate of how come St. John has not had a school? It's not because the people have not wanted. They've been fighting for the school. They've desired a school for many, many decades. But the question of where the school would be placed was always directly tied up to this historical relationship between the National Park Service and people's insistence on holding that entity accountable for past harm, and by way of having it really own, the breadth of its real power, which is that you can do more than you say you can do. It's a matter of imagining that this solution is in fact possible or even worthwhile.
And also, just to note, for those on St. John who didn't go or don't have access or the resources to go to your high school, they have to travel to the next nearest high school is in St. Thomas, right? Which is another island in the Virgin Islands, if you're not familiar. So that means traveling by boat just to go to high school, right? So wanted to add that context in there for our listeners, just so they understand that, like, I mean, it's one thing obviously to be having this conversation about the need for a high school, but when you take into context that it's not just, oh, we can drive 20 minutes or whatever, it's a whole nother issue to consider what travel and movement looks like for what should be a basic human right.
Absolutely. And I would say, there hasn't even been enough research. And I think part of the next portion of this research that I'm conducting and this entire project about sort of schooling on St. John is going to hit this, but there hasn't even been enough research about sort of the contemporary experiences of high school students and what that journey it has been for them, having to, because we have oral histories. I was able to conduct oral histories with some of the elders in the community about what education has looked like over the years and what their relationship to it has been, and some of the struggles of having to commute before there was even a regular ferry service between the island of St. John and St. Thomas. And so we know that for years it's been a problem, right? It's been a kind of conundrum figuring out how best to educate St. John students. And if you don't have access to certain, if you didn't at the time have access to certain resources, we speak of, socioeconomic status and sort of the sort of leverage that gives us. For many of the elders in the community, coming from families that own boats was what allowed them to even be able to go, or knowing a relative or a friend who had a boat and was willing, and having parents who were willing to pay them something to take their kids over, right? Or even knowing people on the island of St. Thomas, because back in the day, because there wasn't a regular ferry schedule, people had to actually live and basically do like boarding school situations on St. Thomas with like random families often, and all of these like sort of like board homes for young people where they spent days, weeks without interacting with their own family members as they were coming up as teenagers. So the stress of education, the stress of not having a school on the island has been felt by many people for many years in many ways. And I'm sure the students right now, while they don't have nearly the same sorts of challenges as those who were going to school in the 60s and the 50s, even the 70s, they still have their own sets of challenges that sort of preclude them from being fully involved students. If you live on an island like St. John and you have to go to school in St. Thomas, that means that, there's only so much you could do and participate in by way of extracurricular activities. It means that your day starts abnormally earlier than other students because you have to make the boat. And if you miss the boat by a particular hour, that means you're late by several, right? Like, there's so much tactical and technical difficulty involved in sort of having to commute for school.
I feel like we've touched on this question in various ways throughout our entire conversation, but environmental issues have so many offshoots, especially when we take into consider environmental racism. And so, how does environmental racism take shape for the Caribbean, particularly? How does it affect women, children, the elderly? And how can we be more sustainable, especially as small islands, and take better care of our environment?
So, I think that environmental racism has so many different faces. And it all depends on, I think, your position, your literal physical situation, and also your positionality by way of who you are and how you identify. In the continental United States, environmental racism more often than not actually shows up in regards to hazardous waste, right? And toxic communities and how poor and black and brown communities tend to have to bear the brunt of industrial waste and their mismanagement and sort of unregulated processes as it pertains to certain industries and their operations. Um, you know, Biochemical waste is dumped in so many tribal communities' backyards, and black and brown people tend to only be able to access housing at the back end of industrial plants, or policymakers will rezone areas so that industries that would normally not be in residential areas or even in proximity to them can, because the population of those residing in the area are not ideal, right? They're like non-white people, and nobody cares about black and brown people, and so they're expendable citizens. They're expendable. Period. Once again, and so that's one face of environmental racism, right? Some of like the classic cases. I would say that in the Caribbean, right, and in the American Caribbean, and this is why reference to sort of the Americas so prevalent in my work because of our status as a territory, right? We are both American and Caribbean. And so we're in such a unique position, and we have to sort of account for not just our history as Caribbean people, but also our history as subjects of the United States. And I would say that within that context, in the Caribbean and specifically in the American Caribbean, that's Puerto Rico and the US Virgin Islands, what we are looking at is actually a manifestation of environmental racism that looks like an exclusion, right? Systematic and systemic exclusion of native and local people, especially people who identify as people of color, right? And have ancestral connections to the land from major decision making processes as it pertains to the environment and its uses. And I don't just mean the local government, right? Because we've seen in so many ways that the local government isn't always an advocate of the local communities and people, and that it more than often operates as an agent of the state and as the greatest agent of the US imperial state sometimes. But I really, when I say local, I mean very, very, localized, very myopic almost context, which is on each island, the people then who live in there and are organizing and having to utilize resources and institutions on those islands, having them included in conversations very early on. And I see that the national park, just to sort of give jacket, as we would say, is doing its part to sort of improve in that particular way. So there's that. But more of that should have been happening and needs to continue to happen. And so, the exclusion is one component. I think also is sort of our situation as precarious island entities that though we do not even produce half of sort of the environmental hazards that are at the foundation of what is now global warming, right? And its effect on the climate, we have to bear the brunt of it. And so we are dealing with all of the hurricanes and we are dealing with all of these environmentally based catastrophes, though we were not responsible for some of the behaviors and actions that have triggered these things. And so I think that's what environmental racism looks for the Caribbean generally, and also for the American Caribbean specifically, you know? And then even beyond that, I'd say it looks like when these environmental catastrophes happen, how are they mitigated? You know, how are they resolved? And who comes in to make sure that we're taken care of? And when do they come in? And the hurricanes of 2017 were so indicative of sort of this massive gap in in a
Who's
system.
American? Hmm.
Yes, a massive gap in our like disaster response system that was absolutely connected to all of these half-baked, misformulated conceptions of American identity and Americanness. You know, we saw sort of the real dysfunctions of the empire and the colonial project during that time. Because but for both Puerto Rico and the US Virgin Islands, we were left to dry, right? We were left hanging. And it was an incredible moment that was eye opening for so many people, Americans on the mainland included. But it told us a lot about, you know, how we've been conceptualized as a part or not a part of the US, you know, and the capital S state. And it also told us a lot about sort of our own peculiar precarities or precariousness as people living within the Caribbean, but holding American citizenship.
There's there's so much I think we could go from there, but I'm so glad that you touched on that point because from somebody who obviously was living in the US and seeing and watching the hurricanes of 2017 and being like, okay, it's one thing, not that this is necessarily acceptable by any means, right? But like if there was somebody, quote unquote, who America should be helping save and rescue at that time, you would think it would have been what are our territories. And to see how both the US Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico were dealt with and not like, and it wasn't a week, it wasn't 2 weeks, it was, you know, excruciating periods of time, right? These are all things that, to your point, the work of the colonial project is one that has very intentionally prioritized a certain type of people and left out a certain type of people. And when we consider what the environment ends up being shaped like, who has affected it and who is being affected most by it, it's one that, affects so many and yet leaves so many of those same people powerless as well. We could actually go on and make this a whole second episode, but but I think for the sake of keeping this discussion brief, maybe we'll do a part two. I'm always open for a part two. Um, in terms of education and the environment, what are some of your favorite examples of how this history and this activism and mobilization has shown up in contemporary popular culture?
Absolutely. I would say that some of the contemporary examples of this work in terms of popular culture have mostly been in the form of film documentaries. Yeah. St. John is on a roll by way of sort of really highlighting its own history and highlighting its own experiences. Um, on their own terms, you know, on the terms of local people. And so there are two documentaries that I want to plug because they're really amazing. The first is actually Our Island, Our Home, which was locally produced by Theodora Moorhead, the daughter of Senator Theobald Moorhead, who was one of the greatest champions for Virgin Islands people, and specifically St. Johnians, as it pertained to sort of advocating against the construction and establishment of the national park the way that it was going. And Miss Theodora is an amazing woman. She is my tante and also one of my own subjects in my research. And so she is a woman who I mentioned earlier as sort of the pointer of this term, benevolent exploitation, that comes out of her brilliant mind. And her father's featured in this film, and it's an incredible documentation of the history of the park and sort of local people's response to it. The other is one that I have not had an opportunity to see yet, but have heard great things about. And it's actually titled Paradise Discovered, The Unbreakable Virgin Islanders. And this is one that has been produced by Peter Bailey, who is a St. Thomas journalist and filmmaker. And I want to say that there's supposed to be two parts to this particular documentary, I think. Yes, it is two films. And it's an incredible documentary about sort of what happened in the wake of the hurricanes, and talking through. And so there is like the beginning of this conversation of, what was the impact of the hurricanes, the responses to the hurricane on the local community, including the educational structure, and the institutions of learning on the islands. And these are two incredible pop culture representations of this work and the direction it's headed.
Perfect. Well, I will, of course, link those for our listeners to check out in their free time. Dr. Samuel, I am so grateful that you joined Strictly Facts for this conversation. I think it's one that is super needed, right? We can't, ever end really pushing this discussion of the environment and environmentalism because we definitely need justice in a lot of ways. And we need recognition of our own voices and the people from our communities doing this work. And I'm grateful for the work that you're doing, uplifting our voices, not just environmentalism, but also education as well. So, links to follow your work, of course, will be in our show notes below. And for our listeners, we hope you enjoyed this episode. Look more, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to Strictly Facts. Visit strictlyfactspodcast.com for more information from each episode. Follow us at Strictly Facts Pod on Instagram and Facebook and at Strictly Facts PD on Twitter.